In this episode of Squirrel Seeker, I'll be taking a deep look into the Caucasians pushing back against Ramzan Kadyrov's stranglehold on Islamic identity in the Russian Federation, with a special focus on those groups fighting against the Russian military on the battlefields of Ukraine. As you may have seen in previous Squirrel Seeker episodes outlining Ramzan's rise to power, an ongoing feud, Kadyrov has been very successful in eliminating many of his political and military competition through a campaign of assassination and intimidation. But some do remain, and they are finding a fertile training ground within Ukraine. The Caucasian resistance has undergone a transition over the past 40 years from its relatively secular origins rooted in the First Chechen Civil War under the leadership of Dzhokhar Dudayev, then transitioning into a feckless, drawn-out, and ultimately unsuccessful jihadist guerrilla movement in the post-9/11 period of the early 2000s, and finally morphing into a blend of the two, with the ongoing chaos of the Russo-Ukrainian War since 2014. In many ways, the International Legion of the Ukrainian Armed Forces has provided an antenna for these movements as they seek out weapons, training, and sponsorship in their never-ending campaign against what they perceive as a neo-imperialist Russia. Only the most radical jihadist groups and personalities are excluded from fighting under Ukraine's banner against Russia, with even these folks sometimes finding a role. In this graphic, we can see the wide range of Caucasian groups fighting against the Russian occupation in Ukraine. Military organizations are shown in violet and political in green. Likewise, Chechen, Dagestani, Ingush, and Crimean Tatar leaders are colored to reflect their ethnic identity. Finally, those groups actively fighting in Ukraine under the banner of the Ukrainian military are tagged with blue, while those groups with a history of fighting abroad, like in Syria, are marked with a black tag. In these cases, the latter would be considered terrorist organizations. Lastly, large black notes show persons that are now deceased. As we can see, the most significant uniting personality across these groups is the currently exiled leader of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, Ahmed Zakayev. Recall from previous Squirrel Seeker episodes that Zakayev is a former rebel fighter and commander who has spent decades working against the Kadyrov regime in Grozny from abroad, following in the shoes of the legendary Chechen independence fighter Dzhokhar Dudayev. Following the onset of the war in Ukraine, Zakayev has been increasingly active in organizing the various Caucasian battalions fighting against Russia in the country, with a particular focus on Chechen fighters. Chechen groups fighting under the flag of Zakayev and under the authority of the Armed Forces of Ukraine include the Sheikh Mansour Battalion, the Khamzat Galiyev Battalion, Ichkeria Oban, the Madpak Unit, 34th Assault Battalion Shalina Zagraya, and the Dzhokhar Dudayev Battalion. Each of these groups adhere to slightly different ideological and practical foundations, with some, like the Sheikh Mansour, Khamzat Galiyev, and Dzhokhar Dudayev battalions leaning toward Islamist, jihadist tendencies, and others, like the Madpak, leaning more toward secular. For example, the leader of the Dzhokhar Dudayev battalion, Adam Azmayev, faces extradition to Russia for allegedly plotting terrorist attacks in Poland, while the head of the Ichkeria Oban group, Rustam Azayev, is a former leader of the Ajnad al-Kavkaz group, which earned its stripes fighting in Syria alongside his pet pigeon, I guess? In the case of the famous warlord Khamzat Galiyev, his followers became increasingly radicalized during and after the Second Chechen War, alongside familiar faces like Shamil Basayev, and hold on to the deep hatred of the traitor Kadyrovites. Likewise, the relatively high-profile Sheikh Mansour Battalion, led by Muslim Chebralovsky, was founded in Denmark in 2014 when it split from the Dudayev Battalion. Although briefly subordinated to the Ukrainian military, it has subsequently shifted toward self-reliance, possibly as a result of its radical ideological leanings. Reports also indicate that members have previously been sanctioned by the Ukrainian government, with one member, Timur Tumgov, even being extradited to Russia in 2018. On the other hand, we have the Madpak unit of the 34th Assault Battalion, which is seemingly more deeply embedded within the Ukrainian armed forces, with less obvious signs of extremism. The MadPack unit notably demonstrated the use of an American-provided Switchblade 300 kamikaze drone in 2022, which would indicate a relatively high level of Western trust and sponsorship. As such, it's reasonable to assess that this unit might be amongst the least extreme members of the Chechen rebel cohort in Ukraine. The leader of this unit, Kazbek Abdurazakov, also notably received the Hero of Ukraine Award in 2023. Outside the Chechen forces, we also see the Caucasian battalions composed of Dagestanis, like the Imam Shamil battalion, led by Magomed Saipulayev, the Ingush Liberation Army under the command of Ansar Glurko, and the Crimean Tatar Muslim battalion under the direct sponsorship of the Ukrainian parliament. Like the Chechen battalions mentioned earlier, these groups represent political organizations with independent agendas and are to some extent integrated under the command of the Ukrainian military. In light of these disparate, well-armed forces, groups, and agendas, the big questions are twofold. Firstly, will political movements like the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, Dagestan National Center, and Ingush Independence Committee be capable of uniting and controlling the various fighting groups off the battlefield and potentially at home? And secondly, will the group's ideologies morph from being based in national independence toward jihadism to the extent that Western allies and Ukraine itself will see them as too great of a threat and therefore look to eliminate them? We don't know the answer to these questions yet, but for historical precedent, we need look no further than the 1990s, when we saw so-called Afghan Arabs seeking to continue their jihad in places like Bosnia and Algeria, quickly wearing out their welcome with local populations and eventually being expelled or eliminated. So what is most likely to happen to these various Caucasian Muslim battalions after the inevitable end of the war in Ukraine? Well, we can be reasonably confident of three things. 1. Whether it's in Bosnia, Saudi, Syria, or even Afghanistan, no country likes having a bunch of battle-hardened terrorist nutjobs just hanging around the place. And so, like in the case of so many homeless refugees, they will probably face strong pressure to move along. 2. Although some of these groups have cultivated presence in Western countries during their decades-long exiles from their Russian homelands, the post-ISIS period has shown that Western security services are ready, willing, and able to block radicalized freedom fighters from returning to London, New York, and Copenhagen by whatever means necessary. And third and finally, one of the lessons that we have learned again and again in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Yemen is that the one thing that's worse than an adversarial government is a collapsed government yielding an ungoverned space. In light of this lesson, we shouldn't expect the West to support these radical groups' inheritance of power in the Caucasus in a partially collapsed potential future Russian Federation. Most likely, the West will seek to continue to marginalize these groups and their ideologies and endorse more moderate nationalist ideologies. Think more furry hats and fewer black ISIS headbands. If you like this video and the information that I provide, please remember to like and subscribe. And until next time, keep your squirrels close.